You know this face. The face of Dracula, a creature of aristocratic cruelty and gothic horror. You know this voice. The voice of Saruman, whose velvet tones commanded armies and nearly brought down Middle-earth. You even know him as a Bond villain, the deadly assassin Scaramanga, the man with the golden gun. But the most incredible, the most dangerous, and the most consequential character Christopher Lee ever played was himself. Before the cape, before the wizard's staff, he was an intelligence officer, a Nazi hunter, and a man who operated in the shadows of World War II. He was a member of Britain's most secret wartime organizations, and his distant relative, Ian Fleming, took notice. This is the story you don't know. The story of how a real-life spy helped inspire the most famous spy in fiction. The call to war. To understand the spy, you have to understand the man. Born in 1922 to a lieutenant colonel and an Italian contessa, Christopher Frank Karandini. Lee grew up in a world of privilege. He was educated at Eton and Wellington College, and he had a remarkable gift for languages. But when war broke out across Europe, a comfortable life wasn't for him. In 1939, when the Soviet Union invaded Finland, a teenage Christopher Lee and some fellow Brits decided they had to do something. They volunteered to join the fight in Finland. However, as Lee himself later admitted, they weren't exactly front-line soldiers. They were given winter gear and mostly performed guard duties far from the action. Undeterred, he returned to Britain and joined the Royal Air Force, the RAF, determined to become a pilot. Training took him to the wide-open skies of southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. He was learning to fly, preparing for the air war. But just before his final solo flight, fate stepped in. During a routine medical exam, a doctor delivered devastating news: an issue with his optic nerve. It was a subtle flaw, but it was enough. He was told he would never be allowed to fly. For a young man so desperate to serve, it was a crushing blow. He sat by the airfield, feeling his war was over before it had even started. But a perceptive commanding officer saw his potential. He told Lee the war was fought in many ways, and with his education and background, he could be far more valuable on the ground. This wasn't an end. It was a pivot into a world far more secret than he could have imagined. The intelligence officer Christopher Lee took that advice and applied for RAF intelligence. With his aristocratic background, education, and his command of multiple languages, including fluent French and German, he was a natural fit. He was soon commissioned as an intelligence officer in the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve. So, what did an RAF intelligence officer actually do? It wasn't about flying planes, it was about making sure the planes knew where to go, what to hit, and what dangers to avoid. Lee's job was to brief pilots on missions and debrief them upon their return, translating raw data on troop movements, anti-aircraft guns, and enemy airfields into life-or-death instructions. His work took him from Egypt to the front lines of the Allied invasion of Italy. He was attached to a Gurkha regiment during the brutal Battle of Monte Cassino, one of the longest and bloodiest fights of the war. Lee himself told a story from this period where he claimed to have single-handedly stopped a mutiny in his squadron, not with force, but by calmly talking the men down. It's a compelling anecdote, though not one strongly backed by military records, that shows the kind of pressure he operated under. But his official role as an RAF intelligence officer was just the start. The deeper you look, the more the official story is layered with whispers of something far more clandestine. The Secret War. This is where the story gets murky, where fact and legend start to blur. Throughout his life, Christopher Lee claimed he was attached to some of the most elite, most feared units of the war. The Long-Range Desert Group, the Special Air Service, and the Special Operations Executive. These weren't your conventional soldiers. They were saboteurs, spies, and assassins. The SOE was Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, created to set Europe ablaze. The SAS and LRDG were ghost units that struck deep behind enemy lines. What do we make of these claims? Historians like Gavin Mortimer, who have studied these special forces extensively, confirm that Lee was indeed attached to these units as an RAF liaison officer. His role was coordination and intelligence, not as a card-carrying member of the SAS. He was the vital link between the secret armies on the ground and the air support they desperately needed to operate and survive. But does that make his role any less dangerous? Absolutely not. To do that job, he had to be right there with them. He was present during operations in North Africa, where the special forces leapfrogged from one secret airstrip to another. Whether he was personally planting bombs is debated, but that he operated alongside the men who did is part of his story. After the war, he received commendations for bravery from the Czech, Yugoslav, and Polish governments, a clear sign he was doing far more than just shuffling papers. If you're finding this secret history as fascinating as we are, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. We dive into forgotten stories like this every week, and we'd love to have you along for the ride. The Nazi Hunter. When the war in Europe ended in 1945, Christopher Lee's service wasn't over. He was given a new, chilling assignment. He was seconded to the Central Registry of War Criminals and Security Suspects, or CROWCASS. Their official job was to compile records of suspected Nazi war criminals. Now, there's a debate here. Some historians, such as Guy Walters, argue that CROCAS was a desk-based record-keeping unit, and that its members were not scouring the remnants of the Third Reich for fugitives. But Lee's own account paints a very different picture, one that is more hands-on. He described the job simply as Nazi hunting. He said that, using his language skills, he interrogated suspects to track down the architects of the Holocaust who were trying to vanish into the chaos of post-war Europe. He would later say, "We were given dossiers of what they'd done and told to find them. We saw the camps, some of them. I was in them." The things he witnessed left a permanent scar. As the now famous legend goes, decades later, on the set of The Lord of the Rings, director Peter Jackson was explaining how a character should sound when stabbed in the back. Lee quietly took him aside and asked, "Do you have any idea what kind of noise happens when somebody's stabbed in the back? Because I do." He then advised on the correct, sickeningly quiet sound it actually makes. This wasn't an actor's research. It was a memory. The Fleming Connection. After the war, Lee retired from the RAF as a flight lieutenant and started his acting career. And it's here that our story takes its most famous turn, connecting the real-life spy to the fictional one. The link is family. Christopher Lee's mother, an Italian contessa, had remarried a man named Harcourt St. Croix Rose. Harcourt's nephew was none other than Ian Fleming, making Lee and Fleming related by marriage. They weren't just distant relatives. They knew each other, sometimes played golf together, and moved in the same social circles. Think about that. Ian Fleming, the man who would create James Bond, was acquainted with his tall, imposing, multilingual relative who had just spent years in military intelligence, liaising with special forces and hunting Nazis. Fleming himself had been a high-ranking officer in naval intelligence. The two men spoke the same secret language. They understood the grim realities of espionage, even if they never shared the classified details. The Bond inspiration. So, was Christopher Lee the real James Bond? The answer is both no and, in a way, yes. Ian Fleming always said that James Bond was a compound of all the secret agents and commando types I met during the war. He never pointed to a single person. But Christopher Lee was unique. He wasn't just some commando type Fleming met. He was a relative who embodied the very ethos of the shadow warriors Fleming admired. The connection feels undeniable. While Fleming was writing his novels, there was a man in his own circle who spoke multiple languages, had operated in secret, and possessed a cool, aristocratic demeanor, while having witnessed the brutal reality of violence. While there's no document proving it, the inspiration seems to be hiding in plain sight. The link gets even stronger later on. According to Lee, Ian Fleming wanted him to play the villain in the very first Bond film, Dr. No. The schedule didn't work out, but the fact that Fleming reportedly saw him as the perfect embodiment of a Bond character speaks volumes. Years later, Lee finally joined the Bond universe, playing the assassin Francisco Scaramanga. He transformed a character that was a generic thug in the book into Bond's dark mirror, a man of wealth, style, and deadly skill. He essentially played Scaramanga as a rogue 007. Lee was not literally James Bond, but he was, without a doubt, one of the real-life figures who lived the ethos that inspired the character. The Legacy of Secrecy. Christopher Lee's acting career spanned over 280 film roles, and he became a global icon. But behind all those iconic performances, the real man remained an enigma, partly shrouded by his wartime service. Much of his service is known, but Lee himself kept many details to himself. Towards the end of his life, an interviewer tried one last time to get him to talk about what he truly did with the Special Forces, to reveal the secrets he'd kept for over half a century. Lee just looked at him with that famous, knowing glint in his eye and said, "Can you keep a secret?" The interviewer nodded. "So can I." And in that moment, he wasn't Dracula, or Saruman, or Scaramanga. He was Flight Lieutenant Christopher Lee of RAF Intelligence, the real spy, hiding in plain sight on our movie screens the entire time.